First of all, for those of you that don't know me, my name is David Brocht. I'm on the planning committee. I'm an attorney with QTech Rock here in Omaha. I also spent 4 years as a state energy director and had time in the renewable energy industry both before and after that. And in fact, I was just talking about with someone in the other room about the difference that the Inflation Reduction Act made. And I will have to tell you that I have some envy for the folks that worked within the energy and environment agencies now as compared to when I was before the Inflation Reduction Act. All of us in the industry understand how significant the Inflation Reduction Act has really had an impact on the kind of projects we can look at and really a variety of things. And so today's panel is really going to be focused on those things that are changing. We've always had credits and tax credits and things like that in the renewable energy industry, but the IRA really made some changes to that. So on our panel today, we actually have representatives first from Nelnet Renewable Energy here in Lincoln, and which is really a great resource for Lincoln. They'll tell you a little bit more about the company. And then Molly Stevens with Mickelson and Company out of Sioux Falls. And they're going to talk about both, first, more broadly about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of those tax credit, and they will weave in some tutorial on that for those of you that are less familiar. And Molly's going to talk about a favorite topic from, particularly in a public power state, you mean I can get those credits directly. That's not exactly what she said, but that's what I hear. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to maybe start off with Eric and let you go from there.
Sounds good. So my name is Eric Moyer. I'm with Nelnet Renewable Energy. I'm sure most of you here who either have paid off a student loan or have a loved one or friend or neighbor who has paid off a student loan has heard of Nelnet. We got into renewable energy because, well, basically about 12 years ago, Nelnet got into providing tax equity financing on renewable energy projects. It's something that we've been doing on the East Coast for quite some time, and encountered an EPC here in Nebraska that was interested in getting some additional capital to expand their operation, and it turned out to be a match made in heaven, giving Nelnet the opportunity to have some additional core competency as far as being able to vet projects from a technical standpoint, as well as be able to self-perform and build projects out. So that acquisition took place about 2 years ago. I came on board shortly thereafter as part of that. So thinking about, the ITC, this came from the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, a fantastic, marvelous piece of legislation that, made all of this a whole lot more accessible. Let's see, did I go backward or forward? There we go. Yeah, and there's no way to really talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and the ITC without also touching on the production tax credit as well, which is a huge part of it. Everybody knows the ITC is basically a one-time credit equal to about 30% of system cost of fair market value. The credit's taken when the system is placed in service. It's very common for solar. It's primarily what we're all dealing with on a day-to-day basis. The production tax credit is more akin to wind. It's a $10 credit, production based on 2.75 cents per kilowatt hour generated of electricity produced. And you have to choose between either the ITC or the PTC. You can't take both or a combination. And the rate is adjusted annually for inflation. So it's not like if you take the production tax credit, you're stuck because rates have suddenly gone up and inflation has gone wild. So it does have some pretty decent flexibility there. It's more common for utility scale systems with high capacity factors like wind. So typically PTC wind, ITC solar. There are some technical gimmicks to the ITC that are worth noting. One of the biggest things is that the property must be in the United States. The property must not be leased out to a tax-exempt entity. Financing with tax-exempt bonds can reduce the total credit, and it can only offset corporate or passive income, and it can only offset 75% of tax liability over $25,000. So it's not just a blanket 30% in every case. So fun charts and graphs. I got this from the federal government, so I know it's good. One of the best parts about this thing, you'll notice there's 4 columns here. We're only talking about 2 things, the ITC and the PTC. So in the left column, I know it's kind of small, might be a little hard to see. We've got our 30% number, which we love and appreciate. And then the 2.75 cents per kilowatt hour generated. That's for systems that are 1 megawatt or less. For systems 1 megawatt or larger, we run into a situation where that number drops to 6% from that 30. So we're only at 6% if it's larger than a meg. Why? Well, that's when we get into wage and apprenticeship hours. So paying prevailing wage and having a documented and accredited apprenticeship program, which is something Raj is going to get into a lot more detail on. But there you pick up the additional 24% for your total of 30. So you can still get a 30% tax credit, but there's a few additional steps that you have to take when you get over 1 meg to validate and justify that that credit is there. And then each of the additional adders, 10% across the board, regardless of the size, whether it's 1 meg or it's over, it's still 10%. And then for the PTC, again, very important to wind, and I know this is the wind and solar conference, so it'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Again, it's $2.25, but then it starts out at 0.5 cents, but then it bumps back up to $2.25. So again, you're back to the same rate, but again, you have the wage and apprenticeship hours that you have to take into consideration. So changes to the tax credits with the Inflation Reduction Act. This is getting into some kind of cool stuff. And this is where we start to really get into the weeds. So the tax credits are extended. There's no phase out. Whereas before, for those of us that have been in the industry for a while, we know that the tax credits step down over time. We drop down to 26%, then we drop down to 22%, and then we're back up to 30%. And it's the glory years again. The larger projects must meet certain labor requirements. I mentioned that apprenticeship requirement. But now the ITC, of course, qualifies for battery, it qualifies for interconnection and switchgear, as well as microgrid controllers, so that if you need to island a facility, all of that equipment is counted for standalone. Whereas previously, you could get by with it if it was part of a solar installation. Bonus credit adders available for qualifying projects didn't exist before, and one of the biggest things I just kind of jump ahead to is the solar wind credits to be replaced by tech neutral credits in 2025. This is kind of another really cool thing about the IRA that I just dig, is that it becomes technology agnostic in 2025. Basically, if it's a carbon neutral or a net zero project, under the proposed regulations, the clean energy PTC will have a base value of 3 cents per kilowatt hour, while the ITC will be worth up to 30% of facility construction costs. And there's a greater number of eligible technologies. So like you see in this list, it includes solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, marine, nuclear, some waste energy recovery properties, and that sort of thing. So it gets a lot more flexible in 2025. So you have more opportunities for gaining access to this tax credit, whereas previous it was just wind and solar, typical stuff associated with the ITC.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Raj. I'm also with Nelnet Renewable Energy. At Nelnet, I kind of sit both with Nelnet Renewable Energy and the corporate tax department. So I'm kind of the guy people come to when they want to get really into the weeds and the details of the Inflation Reduction Act. I will try my best to spare you those weeds while still trying to sort of cover the most salient points about the technicalities of the ITC, some of which Eric has already introduced. So prevailing wage and apprenticeship, this is a really kind of hot button topic right now, because there was a long time where even after the Inflation Reduction Act, you could grandfather a project to not require compliance with prevailing wage and apprenticeship. If you were able to meet the IRS's tax rules for my project began construction, in or before January of 2023. Now what we're seeing is for those larger projects over 1 megawatt, you either have to comply with the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, or you lose 80% of the value of your credit. So your PTC will go down by 80%, or your ITC percentage will drop from 30 to 6%. And so it's really important to make sure that when you're working on commissioning, developing a project, that you have a plan and a strategy to make sure you're going to comply with those requirements. And again, I won't go in too much into the details, but at a high level, it's just, pay prevailing wages to your workers, which are defined by federal statute and by the Department of Labor, and make sure you have sufficient apprenticeship hours. So typically for most projects beginning this year or later, you need to make sure if you have 1,000 hours being spent by electricians and laborers building your projects, at least 150 of those are performed by qualified apprentices. And this is the Inflation Reduction Act's way of, encouraging wage growth. It's their way of encouraging more people to get into the trades and requiring construction companies to operate that way. And, it's really not something that's scary, but I think it highlights the value of working with people and EPCs who have experience in this regard. So, one of the advantages we had at Nelnet Renewable Energy is the EPC that was acquired by Nelnet also spent significant time working in Illinois and had a lot of projects in Illinois where they had a state prevailing wage scheme that's very similar, if not nearly identical, to the federal one. And that's where, you can bring that experience to the table for complying with the federal requirements, and it really helps make sure you're sort of checking all the right boxes, and you don't get a nasty surprise where the IRS says you only get a 6% credit instead of 30%. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the adders, which again, Eric mentioned in passing. I mean, there's different categories of adders that essentially let you take your tax credit and just extend it even more. So, if you meet the requirements for what we call the Energy Communities adder, you're able to take a 40% ITC instead of 30%. And there's a whole lot of value to that. I mean, you think about a $10 million project, you're talking about getting $4 million off your taxes or directly paid to you from the federal government instead of 30%. So the opportunity is definitely there. The potential is there. There's different definitions that are in the statute and from the IRS for how you qualify as an energy community. One of which is you're in what they call a mapped community. And you'll see in a second here why I decided to illustrate using Illinois and not Nebraska. It's because Nebraska doesn't have a whole lot of mapped communities, unfortunately. But the other way you can qualify is if your project site is what they call a brownfield site. And, when people hear the word brownfield, typically the mind goes to, really sort of industrial contaminated kind of wasteland kind of sites. And it's just not the case that that's what you need in order to qualify for this bonus tax credit. The Inflation Reduction Act borrowed from a federal environmental statute that has a very specific definition of what a brownfield is, and it's not one that requires a great degree of contamination. And in fact, the potential for contamination is often all you really need to be able to demonstrate on your site in order to take the extra 10%. And that's also something that we try to sort of help developers and tax equity investors see and take advantage of. That this really is a much broader opportunity than the word brownfield may initially make you think. And the reason that's particularly important here in Nebraska is because the way the Inflation Reduction Act defines what an energy community is kind of makes Nebraska miss all of what they call the mapped communities. So if you're in these mapped zones, purple on the previous slide and green, you'll automatically get the extra 10%. In Nebraska, that's unfortunately only the case in a very limited number of locations. But I would honestly encourage every developer in Nebraska to look at whether they can meet that technical definition of a brownfield rather than worrying about whether you have something that's an industrial site. A lot of people are surprised to learn that a great deal of agricultural sites can actually qualify as brownfields. And that's something that has been confirmed repeatedly by the EPA, which administers the environmental statute where the definition of brownfield comes from. Another great bonus from the Inflation Reduction Act is what they call the domestic content adder. So this, again, very similar. It'll help you take your tax credit from 30 to 40%, or if you have a project in an energy community and you have the domestic content adder, you can actually get up to 50% for your tax credit. So again, this is you're building a $10 million project, but you're going to be able to get half of that value back from the federal government. So it really is a great benefit. Some of the definitions of how you qualify for the domestic content adder, it gets very technical. It's based on where your manufacturer of your modules is sourcing their components, where your inverter manufacturer is sourcing their components, and what those percentages of costs are. Again, I won't get into all those details. I guess what I will say is it just helps and is a good idea to, from the very beginning of your development process, to keep in mind that if you're able to find materials that are U.S. sourced, manufactured here in the U.S., not every component inside a module or inside an inverter has to come from the U.S., but if they're put together here in the U.S. and enough of those other parts are coming from the U.S., there is a very real path to qualify for this adder and get that 50% benefit instead of having your tax credit limited to 30%. And we just encourage you to have those conversations with your EPC firms, especially if they're the ones doing procurement. We try to take a very proactive approach and even recommend to developers and other parties who are coming to us that we have strategies, we've worked with manufacturers, we know the percentages for U.S. costs, and we can help you get that adder. And then the last adder I'll mention is, this one's more limited. This isn't an automatic adder where if you meet certain qualifications, you automatically get it. The IRS is allowed to basically run a lottery program where you can apply for an additional 10% to 20% of your tax credit, which means, by the way, you can get up to 70% if you get all your ducks in a row and you're able to take advantage of all the adders. But your project has to meet certain other requirements. It has to be less than 5 megawatts AC, and it has to kind of tie into one of the IRS's low-income or tribal definitions that exist, such as a community solar project serving low-income households, a project that's part of a low-income housing benefit project, and similar to that. And the IRS basically has an application cycle every year where developers who have projects that qualify will submit their projects for consideration. And thus far, the first two application cycles, most of the categories have been oversubscribed, so there has been a little bit of a lottery. But it's certainly something worth trying to get if you have a project that you're thinking of building anyways that'll otherwise qualify. I think with that, we'll hand it over to...
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Raj and Eric, for starting us off strong. And I thank all of you guys for sticking around this afternoon talking about taxes after lunch. I know it's such an exciting topic, but it really is important for kind of your financial planning on these projects. So just a quick background. I'm Molly Stevens. I work for Mickelson and Company. And a quick background of our company. We began in 2005 with the first ever transferable tax credit, which was actually in the railroad space. So we've been doing this for a very long time. And in 2023, we had almost 100% market share in that railroad industry, assigning $160 million worth of tax credits, both federal and state level. And we also have a lobbying arm that helps our clients in the railroad industry pass state level tax credits. And so actually in 2024, Nebraska became the 12th state to pass a state level railroad tax credit. So fun fact for you as we're talking about transferable tax credits today. So with all of our background in transferability, with the passage of the IRA and all of these renewable energy credits that were typically financed and monetized through tax equity or sale leasebacks, these are now able to be transferred in exchange for cash. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. So let's talk quickly about the investment tax credit transfer market. So like these guys said earlier, eligible projects for investment tax credits are solar, microgrid, fuel cells, energy storage, combined heat and power, biogas, and a number of others. And that's what's currently available under Section 48. So again, the tax credit amount ranges between 6 and 50% of your project costs, and then up to 70 if you can win that lottery for low income. Typically, we see transfer pricing between 90 and 94 cents on the dollar, with a midpoint of around 92 cents is kind of where we see these tax credits traded at most often. And that pricing is typically determined by the size of the ITC. So if you have $100 million, the net amount to the buyer that they're going to save on their taxes, if they pay 94 cents, is going to be, $6 million versus paying less than that. So versus a smaller investment tax credit is simply less monetary value as savings for the buyer. So there's also, if you get insurance on your investment tax credit, or if you can provide an indemnity from a credit-worthy seller or developer, and then the timing around an estimated payment or their annual tax liability, and then the total volume and commitment to one counterparty. So if you have one project that's worth $1 million versus if you have 10 projects that are each worth $1 million, they're going to be willing to pay a little bit more to get your whole flow of projects. And then each buyer that are buying these tax credits have their own buy box based on their risk tolerance, the technologies they know. Maybe some buyers only want to buy solar because it's what they're comfortable with. Some buyers only want to buy $100 million and more. And then others have no preference or very little preference. They just want to save on their taxes. So it just kind of depends on who the buyer is and what they're looking for. Moving into production tax credits, we typically see pricing a little bit higher on these, ranging from 92 to 95 cents, just because there's no recapture risk. Once you've created that energy, sold it, or used it, you can't take it back. There's no loss of production in that because it's already been generated and used. So there's less risk with these ones, and so we tend to see pricing a little bit higher. And then again, pricing determined by size and the creditworthiness of the seller. So how do you actually do it? How does it work to transfer one of these tax credits? So we would go out and we would talk to our database of buyers that we've been in communications with for 20 years and they know how to buy these things. We say, hey, we have a solar project. It's generating $1 million tax credit. Do you have any interest in buying it? And they might say, yeah, sure. So then you place your project in service, or you generate the electricity that generates the production tax credit. And then once that project is placed in service, you have to file for a registration number with the IRS, and then you can execute a term sheet with the buyer. So they say, I want to buy your $1 million tax credit for $920,000, 92 cents on the dollar. After that is executed, you go through a diligence process where you provide all of your production reports, your tax memo, your cost seg, some company information, if you're providing an indemnity, the company financials. And then after that process is complete, you execute a term sheet and a transfer election statement. After that's signed, you can get closed and funded, and you get your cash in your hand as soon as 30 to 60 days after you place your project in service. So it is a very quick turnaround with these, and you can get cash in your hand very, very quickly. And then at the end of the tax year, you just have to file your tax return with your transfer election statement, and the buyer gets that tax credit and gets to apply it towards their annual federal tax liability. But you can get your cash in hand a whole lot quicker than that. So moving into elective pay, which we talked, these guys talked a little bit about. So this is a dollar for dollar direct payment of the credit amount as a refund from the IRS. This is not available to everybody. They don't just go handing out checks all the time. But for any eligible entity, which I have listed here, your tax-exempt organizations, state and local governments. So if you're a municipality making an investment in a solar project, you can get a direct payment. Rural electric cooperatives, and then a few others that I have listed up there as well. So this, again, dollar for dollar, but you can't get it until the end of the tax year, and then the time it takes for the IRS to issue the refund, which could be 45, 100, who knows how many days it is. So it's just a little bit longer lag time. And then I will just mention briefly that elective payment is available for all taxpayers for a few certain tax credits that were created under the IRS. So 45Q, which is for carbon capture. So if you've heard of the tall grass pipeline that's going through Nebraska, that's going to be sequestering carbon, the eligible taxpayer that will get those tax credits will be able to get direct pay for 5 years. It's also available for 45V, which is for clean hydrogen, and then 45X, which is advanced manufacturing. So a lot of the components that go into solar and wind do qualify under 45X. So those manufacturers can get direct pay on those as well. So quickly transitioning, again, like these guys said, they kind of already touched on this, but after the end of this year, December 31st of 2024, these credits transition into a tech neutral tax credit. And so the qualified facility changes slightly. You have to generate electricity and your greenhouse gas emissions rate has to be less than 0. So you have to be carbon neutral or carbon negative in order to qualify. But it does open the door for a lot of other technologies that weren't covered under Section 48, and it closes the door on a few technologies that were covered under 48. And then again, these are also available for elective pay and transferability under the same rules that Section 48 is as well. So for the ITC, it's any project that begins construction on or after January 1st of 2025. On the production tax credit side, this is for any project that is placed in service after January 1st of 2025. So if you place it in service this year, you still get 10 years of the production tax credit as it stands today, versus if you place it in service on January 2nd or January 3rd, you get 10 years as it falls under this law. And then same thing, elective payment or transferability, and then any electricity that's generated from a facility that has a greenhouse gas emissions rate of 0 or less. So that's all I've got. Thank you guys so much for sticking around with us today, and I hope we made it interesting and useful for you all.
So we'll open up for some questions. Raj, I'll have to tell you, while they're thinking, the one having spent much of my career in the development community, I want to dig just a little deeper in this brownfield. I'll admit that I see brownfield, and I have the experience of working on some brownfield projects, and most of them haven't been that much fun. So I'd like to have you help us understand what might fall into that brownfield that we might not normally think is a brownfield.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. Basically, what the tax credit statute did is it just wholly incorporated by cross-reference the definition of brownfield site in an EPA statute. And so what that definition is, I don't have it memorized by heart, but it's essentially any real property where your development or expansion is complicated or may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance. Again, that's not verbatim, but the two key things I would point to are the may be complicated and the potential presence of a hazardous substance. That creates a lot of wiggle room in the statute for the level of contamination you actually need to treat something as a brownfield site. Now, that doesn't mean anything and everything can be a brownfield site. You still need sort of a way to document and diligence what these potential complications are and potential hazardous substances are. But if you're sort of smart about it and you take advantage of certain safe harbors that the IRS has put out there, you can have a lot more projects that are brownfields than we currently see developers taking advantage of. And like I said, we try to encourage developers to take advantage of this where it's being overlooked. And the thing about EPA brownfields is it's a threshold definition. So when you think about projects that get state and federal brownfield funding from the state environmental agencies and the EPA, they look at things that are brownfields, but then also meet 6 or 7 other funding criteria. And that's where you end up having brownfields focused on sites with more contamination and sort of your industrial sites, your spill sites, your petroleum sites. But because of the way the statute is drafted, you're only looking at the threshold condition to see if you qualify for the tax funding or the tax credit. You don't need to meet all those other funding criteria that the EPA uses to focus its program on heavily contaminated sites.
So just to put in context my question, or the reason for my question, for instance, in a lot of small communities that have elevators, grain elevators, that have over the years had different chemicals used for grain treatment, that stopped a project of another type for me and might actually open the avenue for this, in this case, it almost, or at least makes it sound like it's something to review again, because that had really stalled the development of that small community, that part of town, because frankly, we couldn't get a lender to be willing to do anything with it because of the environmental concerns, which were mostly speculative for my mind, but anyway. So in this case, you could get paid for it. So that's interesting. he has the mic. Anyone else have any questions? One I might ask to Molly, because this is newer, this transferability, which had not historically been the case, at least in many respects, and the direct pay as well. Maybe for my own benefit here, touch on again, so I think you've touched on it, but just to confirm for me, for instance, a couple of the projects I'm working on that are carbon capture related, 45Q, that's at the end of the 5 years, then the concept is you've proven the project, now you'll be able to go sell those credits? Is that in the normal, in other words, well, help me think about what happens at the end of that 5 years, I guess.
So the end of the 5 years of the direct pay?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure what the rationale is behind the 5 years on the direct pay for some of those types of projects. But I would imagine it's to fully incentivize those types of projects. And then at the end of that 5 years, then it's available for transfer as well.
And then you'd be in a position you have a history for it then.
Correct,
So.
yep. And it is a very new technology, so proving it for 5 years is.
There's a question back there.
Going back to the brownfields, is there a certain requirement for a wind or a solar project to fall within that brownfield site? Say, for example, there's a localized environmental condition of 1 acre, and you're dealing with a 500 or 1,000 acre project. How does that get incorporated into it, if at all?
Yeah, thank you. So the IRS has not put out formal guidance on the way projects need to be located relative to the potential contamination and brownfield sites. They have said in FAQs, which do not have the force of law, that they're going to look at it on a parcel by parcel basis. And there are rules for sort of what percentage of your project, how it needs to be located, if you have a multi-parcel project, in order to have enough of your project meet the brownfield definition that the whole thing can take the tax credit.
We have a question over here.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. Could you speak a little more to first the interaction or interplay between the federal prevailing wage apprenticeship requirements and when those are also present at the state level? And then some examples where you see them both come up. You mentioned Illinois projects with the IPA, whether it's like an index rec contract or a capacity contract through their competitive process. I see that a lot. Another place where I've seen it is recently in a TVA interconnection agreement. There's sometimes a requirement to use TVA's prevailing wage. Are there other examples where you see it or where you know to watch for it? I'm just thinking about if I'm a developer, I'd want to be aware of that when I go into a financing so I know I can be ready to show compliance. Or if I'm a lender or investor, I'd like to know where to keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. Essentially, when it comes to the interplay of the federal prevailing wage requirements in the IRA and any state requirements, they're essentially independent of each other. So in Illinois, for example, if you have a rec agreement with the IPA that requires you to follow Illinois prevailing wage, you have to wholly comply with Illinois prevailing wage and then wholly comply with the federal prevailing wage requirements, which means you essentially have to do whatever is going to cost you more in any places where they overlap, right? So an easy example is federal prevailing wage under the Inflation Reduction Act. Your wage rates are kind of set at the time you sign your contract. Whereas in Illinois, for prevailing wage, you need to continually update the rates you're paying people on your project as that project continues. And if you have a project that has to comply with both, you just need to pay people whatever the higher wages are at any given time. In terms of areas we see this come up, I mean, really any state that has prevailing wage requirements or any project that has them apply, like the TVA projects you're mentioning, it's just going to vary on a project by project and state by state basis. One of the places we've seen it come up a lot is in the Northeast. A lot of those states have prevailing wage requirements. New York, for example, a lot of those state incentive schemes are starting to say you have to use New York's state prevailing wage laws, which are derived from New York labor law, and adhere to those in order to get the full state incentives And then Rhode Island is another example where we've seen projects where you have to comply with the state scheme. So again, it really, whatever state you're in, it's almost a completely independent question of, is there a state prevailing wage requirement I need to adhere to here? And then figuring out the differences between the state and federal schemes and a strategy for complying with both simultaneously.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the panel. Thanks to all of you for participating today.